Africa had been calling to me long before I ever set foot on the continent. I remember watching The Ghost in the Darkness with my father when I was young and being completely captivated. I was fascinated by the Maasai warriors, their striking red clothing, the dancing, the chanting, the colours, the sheer sense of somewhere so different from anything I had ever known. A few years later, I watched The Air Up There, a fictional basketball film set in Kenya. And once again, I found myself drawn into the people, the landscapes, the culture, the music, and the colour of Africa. I didn't know it back then, but somewhere in those early years, in those early experiences, the seed was planted. For years, I dreamed of going to Africa. And then in 2012, I finally went. I spent 4 months travelling around Africa, and by the time I returned to New Zealand, I was not the same person who had left. The experience had been profoundly life-changing. Africa had filled me with a sense of life, motivation, joy, and wonder that I had never experienced before. There was a beauty to it that was difficult to explain to someone who had never been there. I remember putting my feet into that orange African soil, surrounded by thorn trees, blazing sun, and wildlife, and feeling something inside me come alive. There was a smell to the earth, a rhythm in the air, something you couldn't necessarily hear, but you could feel. I felt as though I had left part of my soul behind in Africa. And then I came home. As the jet lag eventually faded and everyday life began to resume, I started reflecting on what had happened to me. I couldn't stop thinking about Africa, the places I had seen, the people I had met, the experiences I had had, and the extraordinary feeling that I had discovered a part of myself there. But something else began to trouble me. I started thinking about the stories I had been told before I left. People had tried to frighten me away from Africa. I had heard the horror stories about crime, violence, and all the terrible things that supposedly awaited me there. There were warnings about what could happen to me, particularly as a woman travelling alone. Some people spoke about Africa as though danger was awaiting around every corner. Yet I had gone. I had travelled as a young woman on my own. And while of course bad things happen in Africa, just as they happen everywhere in the world, the Africa I experienced was not the Africa I had been warned about. It was extraordinary. It was beautiful. It was challenging, vibrant, funny, heartbreaking, welcoming, and profoundly human. And I found myself becoming increasingly saddened by the realization that so many people might never experience it for themselves because of the stories they had been told. How many people had been frightened away from following their dream of visiting Africa by someone who had never even been there? How many people had formed their perception of an entire continent from news reports, stereotypes, stories, or stories told by someone else? How many people would never discover the Africa I had fallen so completely in love with? That question stayed with me because Africa certainly has its problems. There is poverty, there is crime, there is corruption, there is poaching. There are enormous challenges facing communities, wildlife, and ecosystems across the continent. But that isn't the whole story. There are also people doing extraordinary things. There are rangers risking their lives to protect wildlife, conservationists dedicating their lives to protecting threatened species, guides who know the land intimately and carry generations of knowledge with them, researchers, photographers, veterinarians, environmentalists working to make a difference, communities finding ways to protect their heritage and create better futures, travellers who have been changed forever by their experiences, people who have fallen so deeply in love with Africa that they have made it their home. There are stories of courage, humour, resilience, friendship, adventure, loss, discovery, conservation, and transformation. Those were the stories I wanted to tell. And I wanted to show people a side of Africa that they weren't necessarily seeing through the media. Not an idealized Africa, not a sanitized Africa, not a continent pretending that its problems don't exist, but a fuller Africa. An Africa of extraordinary people and extraordinary stories. An Africa that could challenge perceptions, inspire curiosity, and perhaps encourage someone who had always dreamed of visiting to finally take that step. The question became, how could I share those stories?